Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. It appears we are on the verge of a massive UFC announcement. The main event of UFC 285, Ciryl Gane versus Jon Jones for the undisputed heavyweight title. Now, this video is going to be my reaction and early prediction for Ciryl Gane versus Jon Jones. And then I'm also going to discuss what's happening with Francis Ngannou. There's been speculation for the past week or so that Francis Ngannou is going to PFL. I'm going to discuss that. But before I get into any of that, I usually don't make a video until a fight is 100% confirmed by the UFC or ESPN or MMA Fighting, a legitimate source. This fight is not 100% confirmed by the UFC yet. But based on what I'm seeing, I believe that Ciryl Gane versus Jon Jones will be the main event of UFC 285 and will be for the undisputed heavyweight title. So that's why I'm making this video. Now, before I get into my reaction, do me a favor, if you guys enjoy these types of videos, make sure to subscribe to the channel, make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these videos, and do me a favor, like the video. I would greatly appreciate it. It supports the channel. So where did this news come from? Because there's not ESPN reporting it. The UFC didn't announce it. There is a picture circulating around of the T-Mobile Arena, of basically the electronic billboard on the outside of the T-Mobile Arena, and it's a UFC poster that says UFC 285, Jones versus Gane, World Heavyweight Championship, and it just shows the date, and it shows a picture of Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. And at first, when I saw this, there's a lot of fake news in MMA that goes around. There's a lot of fake Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts just throwing shit at the wall half the time and hoping it sticks. But there's multiple pictures, there's multiple angles, and when you look at it, it doesn't appear photoshopped. And then you add to another layer, Ciryl Gane was tweeting out just yesterday or the day before, talking about, I'm ready for March, Jon Jones, tweeting at Jon Jones, saying he's ready for March. Now, I have believed since fall of last year that the UFC and Jon Jones has come to terms. Jon Jones is ready to fight. And I also believe, regardless of what happens with Francis Ngannou, I believe that Jon Jones will be fighting at UFC 285. There was already speculation, a month or two ago, that if Francis Ngannou wasn't ready to go, it would be Curtis Blaydes. Now, when we heard that news initially, a lot of people were saying, well, why wouldn't it be Ciryl Gane? He was the interim champion. He just had a close fight with Francis Ngannou. Well, it appears that now we are getting Jones versus Gane for the undisputed heavyweight title at UFC 285. My reaction to this, I actually have two polar opposite reactions. When I first realized, okay, I think this is real, I was super excited, super pumped. The return of Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane, who from his UFC debut, I thought he was the new breed of UFC heavyweight, who is one of the elite in the heavyweight division. He had a close fight with Francis Ngannou. Since then, he went out there and beat up Tai Tuivasa, who's a top 5 ranked guy at the time. And the matchup stylistically, I absolutely love it. But at the same time, as much as I'm excited for Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane, if it does come to fruition at UFC 285, I'm super bummed out. I'm going to be honest, I'm bummed out. Just as much as I'm excited, I'm bummed out. I really wanted to see Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. That has been my dream fight for the last year or so. You have a freakish athlete in Francis Ngannou with ungodly power, nuclear power in both of his hands, versus the consensus light heavyweight GOAT in Jon Jones. And now it appears it's never going to happen. Honestly, that's my takeaway from this. So I'm bummed out about this, but I'm mainly going to focus on Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. And stylistically, this is an amazing matchup. Since probably 2013, 2014, I've wanted to see Jon Jones make the move to heavyweight. Ciryl Gane, I've always been crapping on the heavyweight division and the lack of skill in the heavyweight division. Ciryl Gane is not one of those guys. I mean, he's light on his feet, has great striking, is super well-rounded, and this is a very, very tough matchup for Jon Jones, and this may be even tougher than Francis Ngannou, honestly, because I know Ciryl Gane has some finishing ability, but you can't discount the power of Francis Ngannou is much more of a factor in their fight. And outside of that, Francis Ngannou, I thought maybe Jon Jones can just win a decision against Francis Ngannou by avoiding the power and making sure he's not out-wrestled by Ngannou. So this could be a much more challenging fight for Jon Jones. And it's going to be interesting because Jon Jones has not fought since all the way back at UFC 247 against Dominic Reyes. It's going to be over 3 years by the time he steps in the cage against Ciryl Gane. Ciryl Gane's been pretty active. He was the, interim heavyweight champion just back in 2021. Earlier last year, January 2022 is when they unified the belts. In a very close fight with Francis Ngannou. Ciryl Gane won the first 2 rounds, and then I thought Francis Ngannou won the last 3 rounds, but they were close. I think the 5th round was the one that people debated about because there wasn't a whole lot that happened in the 5th round. But nonetheless, on its face, this is a mega fight. This is a massive, massive fight. This is a huge deal. And it's for the undisputed heavyweight title. You have Jon Jones making his UFC heavyweight debut against one of the best in the heavyweight division, Ciryl Gane. I mean, I cannot wait for this matchup. As far as an early prediction, I've talked about it countless times in reference to Jon Jones. I've been watching pretty much Jon Jones' entire UFC career. And one thing I've noticed, he always rises to the occasion. Every time he were to get a championship fight where he's defending his light heavyweight title, and he fights a guy where we're like, okay, this guy doesn't even really deserve a shot. Jon Jones is going to destroy him. It seems like Jon Jones doesn't take that opponent seriously, and then the fight ends up closer than it needs to be. The first Alexander Gustafsson fight was like that. The Dominic Reyes fight was like that. There's probably a couple other examples I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But when Jon Jones is put in these mega fights, he always rises to the occasions. Both Daniel Cormier fights. People thought, oh, this was going to be the closest fight. Daniel Cormier is the best fighter Jon Jones has ever fought. And look what he did in both fights. Dominated him in the first one, finished him in the second one, and finished him relatively early. I think it was 2nd or 3rd round with the head kick. Now, I know there's some asterisks next to that because of PED use, but then you also have Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson too. People were like clamoring for this fight. Gustafsson almost beat him the first time. And now it's going to be a competitive fight. This is a rematch we've all wanted to see. Jon Jones went out there and dominated him. And when I look at both these guys' skill sets, I think they're both super well-rounded. I don't think either guy has nuclear power. I think both guys are going to come in shape. Both guys are going to have good stamina. And I think what it comes down to is, what is Ciryl Gane's wrestling going to look like? Because Jon Jones at heavyweight, at light heavyweight, he was one of the most dominant wrestlers. If he wanted to take you down and beat you up, he would take you down and beat you up. He was taking down Daniel Cormier, who mixed it up at heavyweight, was dropping Josh Barnett on his head. Okay, and Jon Jones was able to take him down multiple times just because he wanted to. And I just don't know if I trust Ciryl Gane's grappling after what we've seen Francis Ngannou do to him back at UFC 270. So for my early prediction, I am going to go Jon Jones by decision. I think he rises to the occasion. I think he does very well on the outside, picking his spots, and I think he mixes in the wrestling. And I just think Jon Jones is one of the most well-rounded fighters we have ever seen in the UFC, and I think he gets it done against Ciryl Gane. Now, moving on to the fact that this is for the UFC undisputed heavyweight title. Well, wait a second. Francis Ngannou has the UFC undisputed heavyweight title. So what does that mean for Francis Ngannou? Francis Ngannou last fought at UFC 270, which was January 22nd of 2022. And what happened is that was his last fight on his contract. But when you win, when the last fight of your contract is a title fight and you win that fight, you are automatically extended for 3 fights or 1 year. Well, guess what? It is January 14th. So we are 8 days away from when Francis Ngannou's extension would be up. Now, don't get me wrong. Francis Ngannou had the knee injuries. He had the surgery. There was speculation he was going to return. But Francis Ngannou always seemed like a guy who was going to stick to his guns. And he wants the UFC to pay him what he deemed that he was worth. And we know Dana White, we know the UFC, they don't like when fighters try to pressure them. They don't like when fighters try to bully them. And it would not shock me if Francis Ngannou is asking for stuff that the UFC doesn't want to concede. Francis Ngannou said, I want a clause in my contract that I can go box. And it wouldn't shock me if the UFC said, you're not getting that. And So now what I believe is going to happen, I think the UFC is going to be petty about this, and we're going to get to that in a second. But I think what happened is the UFC tried to make it work. They tried to make it work. They tried to figure it out for December. Francis Ngannou may or may not been able to return with the injury. And then they're still trying to work it out for March now. Make the Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou fight for March. I believe they finally gotten to a point where they need a main event for March. I think it's March 8th or March 5th. I can't remember. I think it's March 4th, actually. And they finally got to a point, we need a main event. We're less than 2 months away. We need to announce a main event. We need to sell tickets. And they haven't been able to come to terms with Francis Ngannou. Again, I believe they've come to terms with Jon Jones as early as fall of last year. So they're not worried about Jon Jones anymore. He's ready to return. They got a contract signed with him. Well, they have to announce a main event. So they said, you know what? We're going to move on to the next in line. Well, the next in line, you look at the UFC rankings, the number one contender right now is Ciryl Gane. And they've moved on. And now they're making Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. But they're not going to make it for an interim belt because you don't know. You don't know what's bound to happen with Francis Ngannou. If they don't somehow figure out a way to work it out with Francis Ngannou, why do they want to make an interim belt? And then, they've already gave Francis Ngannou a year. It's coming up on a year basically at this point, and they haven't been able to work it out to this point. And the UFC likes to be petty. And in this particular situation, it's not really being petty. They're like, we got to move the division on. So they're going to strip Francis Ngannou. They're going to put the undisputed title on the line between Jon Jones and Ciryl Gane. And then if somehow, and I'm going to get to this in a second, and if somehow they can come to a deal with Francis Ngannou, then Francis Ngannou could fight the winner of Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. And I know what you're thinking. Well, if they're putting this fight, Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane for the undisputed title, and Francis Ngannou's contract is up January 22nd of 2023, well, how is Francis Ngannou ever going to mix back into the equation? The UFC typically in contracts have a exclusive negotiating period. Usually it's 3 months, but it can be longer. So what that means, when you're officially out of your contract, which Francis Ngannou will be in 8 days from now, what will happen is the UFC has 3 months, and sometimes it can be longer, to negotiate with that fighter. And what that means is that fighter cannot go talk to any other promotion, whether it be PFL, Bellator, get a boxing match for whatever company he may box under. He cannot go talk to any other company. So the UFC has 3 months after January 22nd. So they essentially have till April 22nd of 2023 to figure out a deal with Francis Ngannou. And I think the UFC would just kind of put Ngannou on ice. They would make him wait out that period. Sometimes they will waive that period. If they realize they can't get to a deal, they will waive that period. Then that fighter is free to go negotiate with anybody else. But then what happens after that 3 months, the fighter is released from that exclusive negotiating period. But then there's like a year period or a 6 month period. It varies from contract to contract, but it's at least 6 months usually, where the UFC retains the rights to match. And what that means is April 22nd, 2023, Francis Ngannou goes talks to PFL or Bellator, and let's say he signs a deal with them. They give him an offer he cannot refuse. He signs a deal. He has to then take that deal and show the UFC what they're offering him. And the UFC can say, we'll give you this same deal. And then essentially the UFC will retain him. I remember this happening with Gilbert Melendez back in like 2013, 2012. Gilbert Melendez had signed a contract with Bellator. He had fought out his deal, signed a contract with Bellator. The UFC said, okay, we'll match it. So this doesn't necessarily mean that Francis Ngannou is gone, because the UFC could still work this out. But if they're not getting him in that main event of UFC 285, I find it hard to believe they're going to figure out a way to work this out with Francis Ngannou. He seems very hard-headed, and I just think the UFC and Dana White are so petty sometimes, and I think they're just going to say, you know what, we don't need you anymore. We're going to let you go. I think they'll make him wait till April, but I don't think, I have a feeling now, if this main event between Jon Jones and Ciryl Gane is 100% official, my gut is telling me that Francis Ngannou does not return to the UFC. But I hope I am wrong. I really hope I am wrong. The heavyweight division is just starting to mature into a relatively decent division. For years, it's just been garbage. And it's starting to get good. Jon Jones, Ciryl Gane, Curtis Blades. For a while there, Tai Tuivasa was making his way up the ranks. Sergey Pavlovich. To lose a guy like Francis Ngannou, who is one of my favorite fighters to watch. And if you claim he's not exciting, I don't know what you're watching. I mean, every fight, he's going out there to knock somebody's head off. I'm going to be super disappointed if the UFC doesn't find a way to make this work, to get him back in there, even if it is as a challenger against Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane, whoever wins that fight at UFC 285. I feel like the UFC has to figure something out and get him back into that heavyweight division. But my gut's telling me right now that he's not going to re-sign. Now, what happens? Is Francis Ngannou going to PFL? People have said Francis Ngannou's mother or grandmother or whatever, there was a picture of Francis Ngannou at a dinner table and she was wearing a PFL shirt. This means absolutely nothing. First off, I think Francis Ngannou is getting offers from the UFC for much more than $1 million, okay? So you can say the $1 million tournaments, that works for guys like Shane Burgos, who's not getting paid that. Francis Ngannou should be getting paid more than $1 million from the UFC. Can you imagine just the pay-per-view points alone in a Jon Jones-Francis Ngannou fight? It would be massive. So I do not believe he's going to PFL. I believe, if anything, Francis Ngannou is going to go box Fury or something along those lines, or he's going to test the waters. The UFC's given him permission to go test the waters, see what you can get in this boxing match, and maybe the UFC is going to try to re-sign him after that, but I doubt that, because if he goes out there and gets destroyed by one of these boxers, the UFC is going to deem him basically damaged goods. I don't know if they would re-sign him after that. So I don't know where Francis Ngannou goes. Bellator and that Viacom money, but then there's rumors they're up for sale. Maybe they make a bid on Francis Ngannou. I just find it hard to believe that it's going to be PFL. PFL's already not. I mean, they just had a pay-per-view that probably did 7 buys. I mean, 7 probably. Nobody's buying that. I find it hard to believe they're going to lure him there with a $1 million tournament when Francis Ngannou can definitely get more than $1 million from the UFC or in a potential boxing match. And maybe he's going to box somebody else other than Tyson Fury. Maybe something along those lines. But I do not believe he's going to PFL. But the second we have an update on this situation, I will make another video regarding Francis Ngannou. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Am I completely off? Are you excited for this fight? Are you mad that we didn't get Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou at UFC 285? I would love to know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.